Hi folks, I'm Jim Burns. I'm one of the deacons here at TGP, and I'd like to take you through a survey study on the book of Ruth. Now by survey, you've probably seen some of our other videos. It's kind of a high-level overview of what the book is about, and it's kind of to whet your appetite to make you want to study it some more. And actually, in particular, even though I love all the books of the Bible, I guess I would say my current favorite right now is Ruth, mainly because I'm studying it extra hard. Ruth is a very special book. It's in the Old Testament. Time-wise, it happened kind of parallel to the book of Judges, and that was a time after the Israelites had moved into the land and they were doing what God told them to do, or at least they were supposed to be, in trying to drive out all the ites, all the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, you name it, because they were people who did not believe in God and they worshiped false idols. So that's kind of what I'd like you to kind of grasp here. But more importantly, especially during these days where I know things are getting a little bit better, but COVID is still kind of lurking around there, sometimes you kind of wonder if God's really here and He's really working in our lives. This book of Ruth is a beautiful short story / vignette of how God is. He's right here, He's working. One of the things that's fascinating about the book of Ruth is that it doesn't really have any miraculous appearances of God, and the people in the story don't even really refer to Him much. But He's there, and you get to see a contrast between the people that were looking to God for their salvation and the people who weren't. The resources that I've used today, there's actually a couple of them. One of them, and you'll probably see them in the notes being put up on the screen here sooner or later, is the Bible Project study on the book of Ruth. If you're looking for something that's video-based and interesting and a little bit different, I suggest strongly that you go to BibleProject.com and you will see studies on various things, including many of the books of the Bible, and there is one here on the book of Ruth. The thing that's kind of fun about it is they're talking to you, they're teaching you, they're giving you that survey, but while they're doing it, they're actually kind of drawing a picture that kind of keeps your eyes and mind focused and kind of helps you with an overall mental image of what the book is about. So I highly recommend that. And also, I used the New International Version Study Bible Notes on the book of Ruth. So again, historically, like I said, the book of Ruth takes place in the time of the Judges, which is in the Old Testament. Roughly speaking, it was from about 1370 to 1041 BC, so span of a couple 300 years in that range. One of the things that I'd like you to understand in the background, because the Old Testament is kind of foreign to us. It's definitely a different culture. They thought, they acted differently, and they understood God a little bit differently because they were under a different covenant and a different dispensation. One of the things that I think will help you is I'll read a short passage from the book of Judges, and it actually occurs 2 times in Judges chapter 17, verse 6, and in chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Now, really short passage, and you kind of wonder about it. If you bring it into today's culture, everyone did as they saw fit is one of these things where you go like, well, that doesn't sound too bad. Sounds like they're taking control of their lives and doing things the best they can. Well, not so much, because in the Old Testament, the covenant that they were under was the covenant of the Mosaic Law, and they had some very specific things that God wanted them to do. Everything from the way they farmed their crops, to the way they did their sacrifices, the way they came to the tabernacle or the temple. And what this phrase really means is that the people had pulled away from God and they weren't following these rules. So it's actually a bad comment on how Israel was misbehaving. So keep that in your mind, because they really weren't doing very well, and that's where you'll start to see the contrast. We don't know who wrote the book of Ruth. Some people think that Samuel was the author of it. Other people think not, because some of the language in there and some of the references kind of almost seem like it was done during the time of King David, which is a few generations later in time. Doesn't matter. For us, one of the things that is actually pretty cool about the book of Ruth, it's a very skillfully written short story. When you look at it, the whole book is kind of like built up like a pyramid, and the front of it is kind of the mirror image of the back end of it. Even the length and things of like that, and I'll talk to you about that as we go on. The literary style is a short story, like I told you. The themes that are available in the book that you can see, and I would encourage you to look for, because that helps you dig in a little bit. The theme of loyalty, the theme of redemption, the theme of despair and of joy. And again, overall, how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. So, main characters in the book are Ruth, henceforth the name, her mother-in-law Naomi, and a man by the name of Boaz. I'll give you a really quick outline on it. In chapter 1, the first 5 verses is just simply the opening, and if you wanted to kind of give it a title, you could use the word distress. Things were not good, all right? Interesting thing about it is that this little section here in Hebrew is 71 words. Keep that number in mind as I go through this. Going on verse 6 in chapter 1, then it's the return, you could call it the return to Judah. Chapter 2 is the meeting with Boaz. Chapter 3 is finding a home for Ruth. And chapter 4 is the decisive event at the gate. And then there's also a closing, which starts in chapter 4, about verse 13. And again, remember I told you that beginning was 71 words in Hebrew? This ending is also exactly 71 words. So this isn't just something that somebody just wrote down and said, here it is and I'm done. They did some work. They crafted this. This is a very skillfully written book. So let's get into it. In chapter 1, the story opens up with the fact that there's a famine in the land of Israel. And that in and of itself, if you know the promises of blessings and cursings of God in the Old Testament, famine wasn't a good thing. That was an indicator that the land of Israel, the people of Israel, had not been following God and not been obeying his laws. And as a matter of fact, they hadn't been doing it for a while, because famine was not one of the first things that was going to happen to them that was bad. God was giving them kind of a progressively louder wake-up call with worse and worse and worse things. So already they're having a famine. And the story starts off with a man named Elimelech, who's from Israel, and things are bad enough there to where he decides he wants to get out of Dodge, as it were. And where does he decide to go to take his family and get some food? He decides to move to the land of Moab, which is kind of a next-door neighbor, but it's also one of the places where Israelites were not supposed to go, because Moabites, even though they're distantly related to the Israelites, they were far worse. They definitely were all idol worshipers, and they'd even had battles and wars with the Israelites. So why on God's green earth would he be going there? So that kind of sets the tone. I think it's a bad idea. I think you could call it a sin. While the family is living there, Elimelech dies. There's no real details given about it, but just stated that he dies. His 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, kind of carry on the bad idea, the sinfulness of their father, in that while they're there, they lived there for roughly another 9-10 years, I forget the exact number, but then they actually marry Moabite women. And that's another no-no. God specifically told the Israelites that they were supposed to marry other Israelites. They were not to marry anybody else from any of the places where God was not worshipped. And they went right ahead and did it. And just like their father, they ended up dying. I think it was another indication of punishment for their sin. And so here you end up having Ruth and Naomi and another lady named Orpah, all as widows. They're living in this land, and culturally, that's another thing too. If you were a widow, you were pretty destitute. You very much, as a woman, depended on the men in your family to own property, to raise cattle, farm, things like that, to make a living. And if you lost your husband and your sons, you really had nothing. Like I said, you were destitute. So in that position, Naomi, who's the mother-in-law to both Ruth and Orpah, decides that she's going to go back to the land of Israel, back to where her family is. And there's some back and forth between the daughters-in-law and the mother-in-law about whether they should go or not. Orpah decides to take Naomi's advice, and she goes back home to her family. But Ruth, in particular, very interesting what she does here. And I'd like to read that little section to you. And it's in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Ruth actually says something that's very much like an Israelite would say. So it's kind of planting the seed of what Ruth was paying attention to at the time. So I'll start there. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people," that's talking about the Israelites, "and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." And here it comes. "May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even in death I am separated between you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So that is a very classic Israelite oath, when it starts out with, "May the Lord deal with me." So to me, I don't know if you want to say that Ruth is an Old Testament Christian or not, but she definitely said that the God of the Israelites was her God. And I think this is where the story kind of starts to turn from all the sad and bad things going on. So another thing that I want to bring up as we're talking about stuff is what I like to call godly coincidences. In real life, for a Christian, I don't believe there is any such thing as a coincidence because God's in control. It may look like a coincidence to us, but in reality, nothing escapes his control. He's always planning. He always knows exactly what's going to happen. So the story's already set up. So Ruth and Naomi walked their way back from Moab to Israel. And it just mentions, just as one of those godly coincidences, that the barley harvest was happening. So number one problem that drove the family away from Israel was a lack of food. And they're coming back. Here is a time of plenty. The harvest is a happy time. It's the best of times, arguably, for farmers in the land of Israel. So that's godly coincidence number one. So as we move into chapter 2, Ruth, being a devout and hardworking lady, knows that she's got to do something to help support herself and her mother-in-law. So she kind of knows the culture there, and she says, "I'm going to go work in one of the farmers' fields." And that was another thing that was very, very different in the Israelite culture, and that's because God set it up this way. And I'm going to read a passage from Leviticus chapter 23, starting at verse 22, that'll give you an idea of God and how he set up welfare, or actually more accurately, workfare. So here I go. "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God." So basically, if you were a farmer and you had a plot of ground that was a square, I guess in my mind, you would harvest in a circle, and you would leave those corners and maybe the edges there totally unharvested. So anybody who was poor or a foreigner, if they were hungry, they could come to your field and do some work, harvest that grain, and take it home and have something to eat. The other thing that was interesting there, it talked about gleanings. Gleaning is picking up stuff that kind of fell to the ground, just as a general term. So if you were there with your workers and you were harvesting and you were putting the sheaves onto a wagon, take them back to where they were going to be threshed, if some of those sheaves, say, fell off the wagon and hit the ground, you leave them there. You don't go, oh, I'm going to be fastidious and thrifty and pick them up and put them back on the cart. You leave them there. That's something that God said, again, was for the poor people and the foreigner. And while it is a blessing for the poor, it's also another faith and trust test from God. Do you trust God to make sure, or you work hard, but is He taking care of you? Is He taking care of you enough to where if you actually drop some of the stuff that you work so hard for, that there will be enough left over so that your family will have something to eat and you'll have something to sell? So, I love the way God works this out. And the overarching story of the whole Bible, and our lives too, is God saying, do you trust me? All right? And there's far more to that whole Leviticus story about how God wanted people to behave. But I'll move on here. So Ruth goes to a nearby grain field, and another one of those godly coincidences pops up. Happens to be owned by a man by the name of Boaz. All right? And you can see just the way the story is set up, Boaz is set as a godly man. He follows the law of God. And in that passage, you will see that it's stated that he's a man of noble character. Well, that word can be translated as noble or valiant or virtuous. And here I really like the word virtuous because it means he's always trying to do the right thing. And it's fascinating that the Bible calls Boaz virtuous here, but the Bible also calls Ruth that exact same Hebrew word, and that's in chapter 2, verse 1, and again in chapter 3, verse 11. So, in our terminology, I guess you'd say they're loyal, honest, God-fearing people, all right? And you get another little taste of it. So Boaz shows up at his field in the morning, and he says to the people there, the Lord bless you. Now, if he wasn't a kind, godly, loving man, you could see the workers just kind of go like, yeah, whatever. That's not what happens. They turn around and they bless him right back. So there's some good things going on here, some good vibes, all right? Boaz also blesses Ruth in a similar way in verse 12, and he invites her to stay in his fields all the way through the harvest season. Now, we got the idea that the barley harvest was happening, and that's one of the first or the earliest harvests. After that, there's the wheat harvest. So Boaz is saying, I will take care of you. You'll be safe here. Nobody will pick on you because that's not a common thing. People who weren't following God and trusting that what God said in the law and the Torah would benefit them would probably shoo people out of their fields and say, get out of here, this grain is mine. So Boaz isn't that way. He does the exact opposite. He's willing to be kind and giving. All right? As you hear some of the discussions going back and forth between Naomi and Ruth, when she comes back home with all the grain that she's gathered, she asks, whose field did you work in? And Ruth says, a man by the name of Boaz. And Naomi's like, oh, he's one of our near relatives. He's a really great guy and he's a family member. Now, that's something that is also one of those godly coincidences, and it actually is a very key, essential part to this story here. Boaz, being a family member and being a man and one of the landowners there, he has a title of kinsman, which we understand what that word means. It's somebody that's in our family. But the other term is redeemer. And there's another thing in the Jewish culture that would seem foreign to us, but it is also something that God set up for how you take care of some of the clans or families that have fallen on hard times, like Naomi's family, because all the men in the family are dead. They've passed on. God even had a way to help things like that. And I'll read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. If you read the passages where the Israelites went into the promised land, God was very specific about allotting portions of land to different clans and different families and different tribes. And he said something to the effect of like, look, the land is mine, but I'm letting you have it. And I want you to bear that in mind as you go out through your day-to-day things. Some people would be successful and their crops would grow, and other people would fall on hard times, bad enough to where they would actually have to sell their property just to make ends meet. Things like that happen in our culture today. But God said, okay, you can do things like that, but he marked off periods of 7 years, and then 7 times 7 years up to +1, giving you 50 years. That was the major cycle that happened in who owned the property there. And that 50th year was called the year of Jubilee. In the end, when that 50 years happens, no matter who bought what property from whoever, whatever, all the pieces of property that were bought and sold go back to their original families and clans. So it's very important to have some family member there, some man, some father, some son there, to accept the family property, the family inheritance back. And that's why God set this up. Another term that is used in some commentaries is something called levirate marriage. And again, the idea is nobody's family line should die out. The brother would take care of his sister-in-law and have children with her until a boy is born. And then that boy would be the one to carry on the family name and then be the heir for that property. Very fascinating. Like I said, it's very foreign to us because we don't do anything remotely like that now. But that's how God had things set up. And when you take all of that into mind in the background of things, you can see the storyline following those godly laws and rules. So here we are. Naomi says, hey, he's our kinsman redeemer. That's pretty cool. And he's a really good guy. Everybody likes him because he's a godly man. So we move into chapter 3. Naomi coaches Ruth a little bit on how to approach Boaz and ask him to redeem her. Again, this is another one of those cultural things where like, I don't really get what's going on, but basically she said, hey, when all the working is done and the fires have died out, whatever, wherever the threshing floor is, go find Boaz. And he's probably covered up with some sort of blanket or something like that because the nights can be chilly. Go to where his feet are, uncover his feet and lay next to him and cover yourself up. And he will take it from there. He knows what that means. Now, to us, we kind of again look like, what? What does that have to do with anything? Well, it's basically a marriage proposal that is what Ruth was asking Boaz to do. And sure enough, the story goes on. She sneaks in there so people wouldn't see her. She does exactly things the way Naomi told her to do, and Boaz gets startled in the middle of the night, and he looks down, and it's like, there's this lady down at his feet. And once he figures out who it is, and they talk a little bit, Boaz says, okay, thank you very much for being kind to me, because you could have gone and looked for a younger man. Apparently Boaz was not in his 20s or 30s, whatever. But he said, I will make sure that you're taken care of. So Ruth goes home, reports what happens, and we just are kind of sitting on pins and needles to see what's going to happen next. And we move into chapter 4. So Boaz basically walks to the town of Bethlehem, goes there. And this is another cultural thing that we're not familiar with, but we have a series of courts and we have judges and lawyers and things like that, and there are specific places we go to have cases heard. The place where Israelites went was essentially the city gate, because that's where the elders of the city would basically sit down and, I suppose they would talk and socialize, but they were there for the specific purpose of people coming in that wanted to transact legal business, or if they had some sort of problem, if a crime was committed, something like that. The elders of the city would act as judges, and knowing, with their knowledge of the Bible and how God wanted things done, they would make sure that justice was served. So that's where Boaz heads off to. The other thing is, here comes another godly coincidence. He enters the gate of the city, and it turns out that there's another relative that's actually closer to Naomi and Ruth than Boaz. That's something I should have talked about at the end of chapter 3 there, but that's part of the thing that he had to deal with. So he had to go talk to that fellow. So number one thing he had to do was find that fellow. Well, the coincidence is he bumps into him literally when he gets to the city gate. So it's great. Hey, come with me. I want to transact some business with you. And so he goes and they start talking with the city fathers there, the elders, and Boaz says, hey, there's some property. You're the closest relative. Would you like the property? Now, to a farmer, saying, would you like more land is like, well, yes, please. Of course I do. Boaz is a little sage or cagey in the way that he talks about it, because he talks about the good part of the deal first. There's some land that you can take over. And he gets the guy to say yes, and then he says, oh, by the way, you have this kinsman redeemer duty that you have to do. If you accept the land, then you also accept Naomi and Ruth. And then he would have to marry Ruth and hopefully have a son with her to take care of Elimelech's family and property. So here we go. Boaz drops the bomb on him and he backs off. Now, this is interesting because this is another one of those differences that are shown. Boaz is a godly man. He follows God's law. He's kind to the poor. He blesses his workers. All these good things are set up in Boaz's account, if you will. We can see it as the story reader. This other fellow, we don't even get to know his name. So maybe that means he's not very important, but you can see how he acts right away. When he's given or laid out the responsibility in front of him, the first thing he does is back away. Not going to do it. And for him, it's a lack of faith. Because for him, he says, I don't want to do this because I might endanger my own property. Well, what does that mean? Well, everybody needs in the family to have at least one son to carry on the family line. Apparently, for this man, who we don't even know his name, he hasn't had a son yet by his own wife. And so he's thinking in his mind, well, if I go ahead and do this and I marry Ruth and I end up having a son with Ruth and don't have a son with my own wife, then my family will lose their own property to this kid that, is in a different clan. I don't want to do that. That's his lack of faith. If God gives you laws or rules to follow and you obediently and I would say joyfully follow them, he will bless you because of that. This man was playing chicken, essentially. He did not have the faith that God wanted him to have to take care of the responsibilities that God had laid on him. So he backs away, and they do their legal negotiation, and I guess the way to seal the transaction is to give the guy your sandal. So that guy who isn't named gives his sandal to Boaz, saying, the responsibility and the property are yours, which is exactly what Boaz wanted anyway. That's what he was hoping and praying for, I suspect. So the last part of the book is what I like to call they lived happily ever after. And as you go through it, things settle down. Naomi has changed from being bitter to being pleasant. By the way, Naomi's name in and of itself means pleasant. And when she came back to town, she said, don't call me what my name means. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. Well, things have happened where she can see God working in their lives. Things are working out well, so she's going back to being pleasant. And then you start to go into something that's a bit of a family tree here. So Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son, which is the whole point of the exercise per se. Other than the fact that they love each other and they're married, they now have a son to carry on that particular family line for Elimelech, who and his sons who were killed by God. And what's interesting here in the end, if you pay attention to the family line, the child's name was Obed. If you go down through, it tells you who the son and the grandson and the great-grandson are. The great-grandson happens to be King David. So in this little bitty story where God isn't even directly talked about much, there is this battle going on. Maybe one of my Bible professors said that it was actually a battle between Satan and God about wiping out the Davidic line, but actually more importantly, because if you look at who King David is the great ancestor of, is Jesus, the Savior of the world. And so maybe Satan was thinking, hey, if I wipe it out at this point, people won't obey God and fix it up. That'll be the end of the Savior. Well, not true. God is truly in control, and he set things up, and here comes King David, arguably the most famous king in all of Israel's history, and he comes from this family line where there's somebody from the land of Moab in there, Ruth. Something to think about. I encourage you to read the story for yourself and think about all the things that I said. Don't get all twisted around the axle about the differences in culture, but enjoy the way God had things planned out, and even when things were tough, God was there and working to fix things if we'll just be faithful and follow him. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your holy word. There's all kinds of information in there, from your overarching love story with us, and how you want to have a personal relationship with us, but also the details in these little human stories like the book of Ruth, where you take care of everything working in the background. We thank you so much for that. We ask that you would help us to study your word and give us the wisdom and the knowledge we need from it, Lord, just to know you and love you better. Bless us as we go through the rest of our day. In Jesus' name, amen.